participants list. So thank you very much for being here. As Ilke said, my name is Ruthie Musker, and I'm the Strategic Projects and Partnerships Lead for the GODAN Secretariat. So this webinar will discuss open data strategies and policies across sectors in agriculture and nutrition, while presenting key points and recommendations for identifying and involving different stakeholder groups and sectors to ensure an inclusive and collaborative process. As Ilke said, we will discuss questions such as how do you convince someone to open their data and how to put an effective policy in place. I know that you've heard quite a bit about GODAN already, so I won't go into any specifics, but just as a refresher, GODAN is a network of over 600 partners who all advocate for open data in agriculture and nutrition. Each partner has unique challenges, needs, strategic approaches, and partnership priorities. The key points I will discuss are from my experience with the GODAN partner base and from projects I am working on specifically for the GODAN Secretariat. The structure of this webinar will first be on stakeholder groups, and then on some key points on open data strategies and stakeholder involvement, and then discuss how we have applied them in a GODAN context. And as Ilke said, we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. Oops. Oh, yeah. So just very quickly, I'm going to define a stakeholder. This is a term that can sometimes get confused in different contexts. So just to be clear, when we use the word stakeholder, we mean organizations or individuals who have data that others need or are seeking benefits from open data. In the GODAN context, we specifically use the word partner. And so in this presentation, I'll use them a bit interchangeably. So I hope that doesn't confuse anyone. And when we talk specifically about convincing others about open data, I'll use the phrase audience. So within the GODAN Partner Network, we specifically target and divide up the partners or stakeholders into the following groups. So government, industry, civil society, foundations and donors, universities and research institutions, and farmer organizations. But of course, each of these sectors have different needs and challenges. But it is important to understand that each of these sectors can be subdivided into many different sections also, each of which have their own individual needs as well. However, ultimately, they all should want to produce a common goal. In the example here, if you only have any one of these representatives, so a Minister of Information or a statistician in the Ministry of Statistics, you're missing out on a potentially important stakeholder. Just because you have someone from government involved doesn't mean that they necessarily represent the entirety of the government's opinions, needs, goals, and challenges. And it's very important to consider within sector in addition to cross-sector collaborations. I know that you can quickly run into the problem of everyone is important and must be included. And this example is not to show that everyone needs to be included all the time. It's more to show that if you have a specific goal in which a certain sector needs to be involved, carefully consider exactly who from the sector or organization is the best person to interact with. And towards the end of this presentation, I'll give some examples of the specific stakeholders that GODAN is working with within sector and through cross-sector collaborations. So I'll now go into some key points for open data strategies. As I mentioned before, these are primarily from my experiences working with GODAN partners and listening to the challenges and lessons learned, as well as my own perspectives from working on GODAN projects. I'm very interested to hear your own perspectives at the end of this presentation of your challenges or approaches or your key points for achieving open data strategy. So please let me know your ideas at the end of during the questions section. So the key points that I'll go over are understand what you are trying to achieve, how to engage with large organizations, understanding user needs, and how to convince individuals and organizations to open their data. So the first one, understanding what you are trying to achieve. To start on creating an open data strategy or policy, you and your organization must have a very clear understanding and agreement on what you are explicitly trying to achieve. Establishing this step is very important because there are so many variations. So some questions are, what do you hope for in the short and long term? Are you trying to create a strategy to open up data because of a policy that has already been created, or are you creating a completely new policy? What data do you want? Do you want the data to be open to make a certain decision or to perform a specific research project? Or should the data be open for transparency and accountability? Creation of a policy and opening up data is very different than successful policy implementation, monitoring, and compliance, and ensuring data is open responsibly. It's important to note that any goal is okay. So if your goal is just to create a policy, that is a wonderful goal. And then as the policy has been developed, it will then continue into how do you ensure monitoring and compliance. So none of the questions that I'm saying here are necessarily saying that any goal is wrong. It's just to ensure that you and your organization know exactly what goal you're trying to achieve. And of course, I'll discuss some of the ways that GODAN is doing this later on in the presentation. So this is usually a step where many stakeholders come together to discuss what the overarching goals are, but it's quite easy to get confused if you don't have a clear idea of what your own goals are as an individual and as an organization as well. Once you know your own goals, you can more easily discuss with other stakeholder groups, and it's much easier to determine whose voice is necessary in the space as well. Also, once you know your goal, it's much easier to see what success looks like and determine measurements of impact, indicators of success, and sustainability of the goal. That is to say that the policy is being followed, the data is continuously updated and is high quality, and it has the funding to support the continuation of the open data release or strategy or policy. Additionally, if you're a project that depends on external funding, having an explicit goal will help you guide the project in the right direction and be realistic about achieving your success indicators. Additionally, you can start to identify who has the power to make decisions and who has the power to influence that person once you know your goal. This will help you to begin to identify further stakeholders who have the power to push your strategy forward, to advocate on your behalf. And again, yes, this is where an explicit goal helps. And just to note that the goal doesn't necessarily have to be a specific data question. It doesn't need to be, how do I open this many data sets, or this type of data set, or how to create certain types of open data training. It can be around agriculture and nutrition outcomes as a goal, of which open data is the means to achieve that. And since I've just mentioned the data question, the next point is to look behind goals of organizations to see where the underlying open data question is. For many strategies and policies, you may want to work with a large organization such as a government, a food company, or a UN body. In GODAN's experience, large organizations can be challenging to work with, but they're essential. They have a lot of influence and quite a lot of power for overarching change. If you are trying to engage with large organizations, it's possible to identify the underlying open data question in their goals that already exist. It's very difficult to convince a large organization to obtain a completely new goal. So if open data was separate to the goals that already exist, that might be quite hard to convince them. But if you link to a goal that they already have, this is another option that could potentially work. For example, governments that are seeking to achieve Sustainable Development Goal 2, or really any of the Sustainable Development Goals, this has a huge open data component. Donors who want to increase their return on investment also has a big open data component. And increasing the quality and quantity of high impact research that contributes to global food security also has a big open data impact for universities. And just because a stakeholder or audience isn't asking a specifically data-focused question or just data-focused goal, it doesn't mean they shouldn't be involved in the conversation and in order for open data to help them achieve their goals. And those three examples that I listed with governments, donors, and universities are examples that I'll touch on later in the presentation. So understanding user needs. Open data is, of course, meant to benefit everyone, and the overarching goal of open data is to improve lives. So whether you are developing a policy, a training, releasing data sets, or working in open data advocacy, there is always an end user who you are expecting to follow your policy, participate in your training, use your data sets, or be receptive to your advocacy. You must make sure you identify your end user, work with them, and understand their needs every step of the way. No policy or open data strategy can be successful without deeply understanding how the data or the policy will be used. There are countless stories of fantastic ideas and goals that were not as successful as they could have been just because they didn't engage their users. And how do you get people to release their data? Well, first of all, having a joint common goal is a very useful step for beginning to open up and share data. As I've mentioned a couple of times previously, and one of the main mandates for GODAN is that everyone can benefit from open data. If you can find out how specifically a certain stakeholder, whether it be an organization or a person, can benefit from the data being open, this can massively increase the likelihood that they will open their data. Trust is a massive component of convincing people to share and open their data as well. I was recently sent a paper from Musker University in Uganda about information quality, sharing, and usage in farmer organizations in Uganda. The main result of the paper is that information and data quality and sharing and usage of information all increase due to trust amongst organizations and individuals. Of course, a trusting relationship needs common benefits, constant interaction and feedback, openness and transparency, and so the components of trust building may be integrated into the open data strategy and stakeholder engagement. My apologies, I didn't put the link to the paper in the presentation, but I can absolutely send it to maybe Ilke, and she could send it to all the participants of this webinar. Trust also has an aspect of data responsibility. Opening data responsibly means that open data does not result in a power imbalance amongst stakeholders. So that is to say, just because you have access to internet, you have access to IT skills and a large amount of money and a resource base, that doesn't mean that you should get more benefit out of open data than those who do not have those resources. So practicing responsible data approaches should be a key concern and policy of all actors, from ministries to companies gathering large amounts of data, to policymakers, smallholder farmers. I encourage all of you to read GODAN's paper on data responsibility, which was published in 2016, which you can find on our website. And it delves much more deeply into the stakeholders and actors involved in open data, their data types, and recommendations for opening data responsibly. Like I said, every open data strategy should incorporate this responsible data approach. I'm sure some of you have heard of the FAIR principles, but just in case some of you haven't, when we talk about open data at GODAN, we use the FAIR principle to define what it means, but this can also be used as a way to help craft a strategy around open data. So FAIR stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And for data to be as useful and high quality as possible, it must comply with the aspects of the FAIR principle. So findable means that the data can be found and curated. Accessible means that it's usually machine readable code, so it can be easily processed by a computer. And data can be interoperable so that it can be manipulated and aggregated with data from elsewhere to produce results that are of practical use. And reusable means that the data set should be openly licensed. So even though this is a way of gauging how open certain data is, it can also be viewed as a process to integrate into your strategy to ensure that your data is as useful as possible. Okay, and how to put an effective ethical policy in place. Two fantastic resources that I would recommend and that GODAN has used are the Open Data Institute's How to Write a Good Open Data Policy document. It's an excellent resource for creating an open data policy. And GODAN has just worked with them to create a template to assess any policy that exists already or to assist with writing a new open data policy. The Open Data Institute has used this to help governments create their own open data policies. And I'll discuss a bit about how GODAN is retroactively assessing policies that already exist. And the ODI's template also has a focus on ethics and responsible data to ensure that this is integrated into your policy. The ODI also has a specific template for data ethics called the Ethics Canvas, which can help you and your stakeholders to determine the potential ethics considerations associated with your open data strategy or goal. By carefully completing the Ethics Canvas, you may see which future stakeholders must be engaged and considerations that must be applied. And so based on these key points, I'll give some examples of how GODAN is interacting with partners and stakeholders for certain open data strategies and projects. So the first is on the GODAN Partner Network. GODAN is an advocacy organization, and this explicit goal of GODAN is to convince the world that open data for agriculture and nutrition is important. We focus on the audience that isn't already convinced about open data or hasn't heard of it, and through working with our partners, we show tools and success stories to help achieve this overarching goal. GODAN currently has over 600 partners that have committed to our goal, which is stated in our statement of purpose. Which encourages cooperation and collaboration amongst all stakeholders in all parts of the global food system to advocate for open data in agriculture and nutrition. GODAN's approach for the partner network is that of inclusivity. Everyone has a story to share, everyone should be an advocate for open data, and everyone's voice should be heard because everyone has something to gain from the data being open. To convince large organizations that open data is important, GODAN is showing that large numbers of people globally are seeking data and opening data, which may help to influence at the high level. So around donor open data policy and practice, I mentioned before that return on investment for donors is a big component of has a big open data component, and so they're becoming very interested in what open data and open data policies and management can do for them. GODAN has just released a report on donor open data policy and practice in October of this year from 3 donors of jointly funded agricultural programs, so USAID, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and DFID. So I'll walk you a bit through our strategy process to show you how we're helping the donors to improve their policies. So GODAN was approached with a specific question. So the donors have open access policies, but they don't know how the policy is used and how effective the policies are. But they needed evidence from their jointly funded programs to justify strengthening the policy and investing in building capacity both within the donor organization and with implementing partners. Okay, so what the donors are trying to achieve is finding concrete evidence from researchers, implementing partners, and within the donor organization that a better policy, training, and data management is needed. This evidence is needed to make the case to the decision makers within the organizations. This was a very explicit question that outlines the collaborators needed, what information is needed from each of them. This wasn't a specific data question about what data sets to release, but the open data components were built into the overarching goal. The users of the final result were the implementing partners and the donors. They were kept in the loop and asked their needs throughout the process. The final results of the paper was an analysis of the policies and how they could be strengthened. We used the Open Data Institute's How to Write a Good Open Data Policy template to show where the strengths and weaknesses of the policies were. The evidence needed to justify strengthening the policy was found through the interviews with relevant stakeholders. The 3 donors, after reading the report, signed a statement in which they committed to a joint effort to develop a more harmonized approach towards open data. And now we're trying to get more donors involved to hopefully see wider change towards better open data policy in the foundation and donor space, and have that improved data quality and quantity that comes out of the projects and out of the implementing partners. GODAN is also working on a project with PUSH to analyze university open data policy. PUSH stands for Presidents of Universities United to Solve Hunger, and they are a consortium of universities from around the world that have the collective mission to end hunger and poverty both locally and globally. And as previously mentioned in the example, research funders such as DFID, USAID, and the Gates Foundation are asking for open data compliance, but harmonization of terminology, expectations, data handling, and sharing are lacking, which leaves researchers confused while the data quality suffers. The PUSH project seeks to understand universities' views in terms of obstacles and opportunities in advancing open data in the researcher and university space. The explicit goals of the project are to identify issues and obstacles universities must address in developing university policies, procedures, and platforms for open access and open data. So we're trying to identify best practice and guidelines, as well as cautionary lessons learned for implementing open access and open data systems, and to create a set of open data tools, policy and practice guidelines, templates, and best practice examples. We are primarily working with university stakeholders, but this is a good example of showing where there are many perspectives even within universities. We are speaking with librarians, researchers, grant writers, heads of institutes, those who are in charge of repositories, IT experts, etc. And all of them are part of the university system, but they have very different needs and challenges. They have different ways they would use the data, different ways that they release the data. And so we're really trying to detangle the university as a whole's perspective on open data policy, but going into those different sections to determine the individual needs and challenges. So this project is still in progress. We're working with the university both as informants to our project and as users who may use the open data tools and policy and practice guidelines. Hopefully the results of this project will be released in early 2018 of next year. And so GODAN has also been working on the Agriculture Open Up Guide, which was previously known as the AgPack for those of you who have been to some of the AgPack sessions and webinars. We're now calling it the Agriculture Open Up Guide, and we'll do a launch on that sometime next year as well. But the Agriculture Open Up Guide aims to help governments to open up their data and create policies. And these guides are an initiative from the Open Data Charter, and they're curated resources that provide inputs and insights on how to make open data available and to support its use in a particular sector. There are 3 Open Up Guides currently in progress: anti-corruption, agriculture, which GODAN is leading, and one on climate change. So the justification for a government to open up data for agriculture is primarily through SDG 2, so food security through sustainable agriculture. It's no simple task, and it means sustainably increasing agricultural productivity, creating more resilient food systems, and it also means shaping more accessible and equitable food markets. In order to meet these challenges, growing volumes of data generated by the government must be organized, and they're beginning to recognize this. Critical data sets that governments currently own could be used to accelerate innovation and change, but are inaccessible. So the current Open Up Guide, the beta version that you see on the slide, was created to provide a roadmap for governments and other stakeholders considering what open data they could publish to support the food security and agricultural sector. Like I said, we released the first version in 2016, and we're working on a second version to be released next year, but we have quite a few lessons learned from this project that I'll share with you here. So one of the first things is we were trying to speak to too many audiences at the same time. As I showed in that first slide with government, if you're trying to speak to a policymaker, a minister, an informatician, and someone who's trying to convince governments to open up their data all at the same time, of course you're going to confuse people, and you're not going to give each individual audience the best information that they need in order to make the best decision. And so in order to overcome this in the next version, we reorganized our goals, we prioritized our audiences and approaches. And since we had talked to many people about this work, some of which I see in the participants list, we know the types of people that are involved in open data and government, and we tailored our approach to each of them. So the audience that we established were high-level government decision makers, policymakers, those who are trying to convince the high-level government that open data is important, and those who have no idea what open data is and why it is useful. Of course, there's always overlaps in these audiences, but this helped us to tailor the right information to the right people to maximize our advocacy efforts. We focus on 3 questions in this resource. So why is open data important to realize SDG 2? So this is where we are using open data to help achieve a goal that already exists. And what should be the role of governments in regard to publishing open data for agriculture? What data is needed to catalyze sustainable agricultural production in support of SDG 2? And how to implement an open data strategy to realize impact with data on SDG 2. So we explicitly laid out the audience, we explicitly lay out the questions that speak to each one of the audience. And these were very much focused around understanding what our user needs were and how we could best help them. And one unexpected hurdle that we ran into was, and of course you always run into unexpected hurdles, was the name of the resource. So when the Open Data Charter first began creating the guides, They were called sector packages, and our first version was specifically called the Agriculture Open Data Package. However, package means something very specific with certain stakeholders, for instance, a downloadable data package or a potential funding source. With the name of the new Open Up Guide, it is now much clearer what the resource is meant to do and how it's meant to be used. And finally, in July 2017, GODAN hosted a conference together with the government of Kenya and 15 African ministers, including from South Africa, the Congo, Sudan, Kenya, Uganda, Sierra Leone, Rwanda, and Ghana. The conference was initiated because of the joint goals of the ministers to achieve sustainable agriculture, food security, protect smallholder farmers in the face of climate change. This is an example of the government committing to open data to achieve a goal that already exists. The ministerial conference was convened to mobilize this high-level political support to ensure availability, accessibility, and usability of data for agricultural planning and decision-making in the Global South. The conference ended with the 15 African ministers signing a declaration for comprehensive open data collaboration in the nutrition and agriculture sectors in order to combat global food security. The conference saw over 800 high-level participants attend, from over 100 countries, private sector, academia, think tanks, civil society, youth organizations, and research networks, development practitioners, the UN. And it was explicitly stated in the declaration how important the collaborations are with those other sectors for the government. It was important for them to be there in Nairobi for the conference, and it is essential that they continue the collaborations as they all move forward. This example shows how a goal was outlined. The declaration explicitly shows their goals and the stakeholders that should be involved, so it is easier to understand what data needs to be opened, how the stakeholders should be involved, and how to create a strategy. And the overarching conclusion of all these examples is that people worked together, they recognized challenges, they took risks, and developed strong partnerships and relationships. Tremendous progress can be made both within sector and cross-sector collaborations. It just depends on the common goal. Through building collaborations and sharing challenges and helping each other, this will be the best way of creating and implementing and achieving our open data goals and strategies and policies. Thank you very much for listening. And from talking with Ilke, I guess I'm looking at